Okay, thank you very much, Charles, for this opportunity to take the audience through what to expect in the next 5 months as Nigeria prepares to for a change of leadership at a very critical point in its political and economic life. And just after a few weeks after he turned 62, uh, and still facing critical economic and socio-political challenges. So I'll start by going through the key timelines for the next few months as we prepare for the election. On 28, campaigns officially began. That's presidential and national assembly campaigns officially began on 28th of September. Um, so on that date, both the main all the 18, we have 18 political parties participating in this election. Um, all of them were supposed to have kicked off their campaigns. Interestingly, only the PDP had any function that day to mark the beginning of the campaigns. All the other parties didn't really have anything. The Labour Party did something, but it wasn't an official takeoff of the campaign. So yeah, so campaigns have officially began, but nothing much officially. There have been some rallies and other things happening, but yeah, some of them have not officially kicked up their campaign. On the 12th of October, we'll have the gubernatorial and state House of Assembly campaigns start. And then on the 25th of February, we have the presidential and national assembly elections taking place. Then 11th followed immediately on the 11th of March, almost 2 weeks after, with the gubernatorial and state House of Assembly elections. So these are the set dates as put out by INEC. But then this is Nigeria. A lot could happen between now. And I would like to say this is the longest election period campaign period that we are having since 1999. Before now, we normally have about 3 months of campaigns, but now we're having like 5 months of campaign. So next slide, a lot of things could still happen before the next before the date set for the election. And what could go wrong? We still have terrorism and bandit attacks in the Northwest. That is a big risk that has been going on for years. The military has stepped up attacks, counter attacks recently, targeting some of the leading terrorist leaders. Not much. I think that has sort of led to a bit of what's it called, gains on the part of the military. The killings and abductions are not as bad as they used to be some months ago. So, but it's still a risk. We are seeing abductions still take place. We are seeing communities still displaced. There are still several areas that you will not be able to access without heavy military presence. Some of the most affected states in this area include Zamfara, Katsina, and then southern Kaduna. These are all areas under constant attacks where most people will be careful about going into without fear of being attacked or kidnapped or abducted. So these are areas that are still risky. Then we also have Benue, Sokoto, and Niger states. These are states also in the, and then of course states in the Northeast. All these are areas where in many local communities you'll be a bit careful how you move around, not because of the insecurity situation. Northeast governors recently raised an alarm that the bandits that are being displaced in the Northwest are relocating to the Northeast. And this is significant because most of the bandits that are operating in the Northwest relocated from the Northeast when the military increased attacks on Boko Haram and the Islamic State of West African arm. Most of them relocated from the Northeast to the Northwest and started causing troubles. And now that there's been increased attacks in the Northwest, we are beginning to see, or the governors are claiming, some of these militants are relocating to the Northeast. And so if we are not careful, we start seeing the Northeast, the security situation, which has improved significantly in the last few years, start deteriorating again in the Northeast. So the governors were raising alarm on these things. Most of Borno State is only accessible with military escorts. So apart from Maiduguri, if you have to leave outside, you have to move outside Maiduguri in Borno State, you need military escorts to be able to do that. That shows the level of insecurity in most of these places. The Abuja Kaduna road is still a bit of a risky place to travel through. There are several areas this thing. So then Abuja is still not immune to deadly attacks. We saw early this year some deadly attacks, some attacks on Abuja where there was a major prison break, and then there was an attack close to Aso Rock, the seat of power. We can't rule out that any of these attacks could still take place. So there's a lot of insecurity around, and that could risk the last election in 2015. Because of insecurity, we postponed in the last for 6 weeks. We can't totally rule out that happening now if there's a major security breach. So those are the risks we face going into the election. Besides the Northeast and Northwest, in the Southeast, we also have serious issues around insecurity. There have been targeted attacks against security agents in the Southeast. On 28 September, 5 soldiers were killed, attacked and killed, shot at in the Southeast, Anambra State, and killed. A senator and the Obas convoy was attacked, and he survived, but most of his security aides were killed. The most affected states in the Southeast are Imo and Anambra. So election in some of these risky areas could be affected by the level of insecurity in these areas. And then also, if they are not curbed enough, it's possible maybe elections are postponed in some areas, or maybe not, but it impacts on participation. So those are the risks we face ahead of the elections. So let's look at the elections itself. It's been described as the most competitive presidential election since 1999. Some say it's the most competitive since Nigeria's independence. But it's become the most competitive election. And why is it competitive? Since 1999, we've had basically 2 elections. First, it was PDP dominating. In 2015, APC emerged and overthrew the PDP. And it's been like a 2-party system until in 2019, we had basically a PDP and APC affair. 2023 looks like it's going to be different. Peter Obi has emerged as a phenomenon, and he's no longer just any other candidate. He has emerged as a credible third-party candidate for the Labour Party, and looks set to challenge the dominance of the 2 major parties, the PDP and the APC. There's also an outsider, or who is also some level of contender. That's in terms of Rabiu Kwankwaso of the New Nigeria People's Party, New Nigeria People's Congress. He's also dominant, or he also has strength in the Northwest, most likely the Northeast. So these are the 4 leading contenders in the race, and it's likely to be a keen race between the 3 candidates. I must note that 3 leading polls, there have been some polls so far showing Peter Obi having the advantage. So let me analyze the 3 candidates. What do they bring to the table? We have Peter Obi. He's the youngest candidate with strong support from Nigeria's frustrated youth. Most people are wondering why Peter Obi has become such a phenomenon. It seems to go back. I think Peter Obi is not what's it called? He's a product of the youth frustration with the current system. He didn't create a movement. A movement created the movement created him. The movement looked at all the candidates presented before the Nigerian people, and the youth, fed up with the system, decided to adopt Peter Obi. So Peter Obi is not really in charge of his movement. The movement is in charge of him and is driving They are the ones driving his campaign and making him relevant. So not perfect, but comparatively a saint by Nigerian standards. Yeah, Peter Obi is not the perfect politician, but when you compare with most Nigerian politicians and the standards of the Nigerian political setup, he looks like the best thing you could have based on current circumstances. He was Anambra's prudent governor between 2007 and what's it called? Yeah, he ruled Anambra up to 2014. Was it 2014 or 20? This I forgot. Yeah, he's a successful businessman. He was named in the Pandora Papers, but there was no evidence that he diverted state fund. His people movement has a popular slogan called "We know they give shishi," which basically tries to tie into his prudent nature and assumed anti-corruption stance. Backed by trade unions, yeah, he's supposed to be backed by the two major trade unions, the Nigerian Labour Congress and the Trade Union Congress. But then he doesn't really draw his strength from the labor unions. His strength is mainly in the Nigerian youth population. Backed by what's it called? He's the favorite in 3 campaign polls by 3 different organizations. Yeah, 3 different polls have put him well ahead of all the 2 other candidates. He's also heavily his candidacy is heavily supported by ethnicity and religion too. He's the only Christian in the race among the 3 major candidates, and he's also of the Igbo ethnic tribe, which have always pressured to become accepted, or what's called to have access to the presidency. The next slide. What are his disadvantages? Doubt about his national acceptability, much less popular in the North, and his limited financial resources. Unlike the other candidates, he's the one with almost no access to the public funds during this campaign, which is very vital in Nigerian campaigns. He has no governor, he has no state representative at the state level, and also the financing of his campaign is likely to come from private sources, and that's going to be a huge challenge. He will need a massive turnout of non-regular voters to make a difference. Nigeria's incumbent political establishment will be against his candidacy. Him emerging as a president will be anti-establishment, and that could mean the establishment will want to make sure that he does not emerge, because that could risk a lot of political interest and careers. Possible intimidation of his supporters by the security forces, that's the risk. Because of anti-establishment expectations, he's likely to face intimidation from security agencies, or his supporters are likely to face it. We've seen some evidence of that already happening, and so that's likely to happen when campaigns even intensify. He may not be able to maintain current momentum. There's also the risk that because of lack of finances, and then because his movement is mainly led by the youth, a heavy clampdown on it by security agents or lack of money could affect the momentum he's currently enjoying. The other candidate is Abubakar Atiku popularly called Atiku of the People's Democratic Party. He's been a contender almost since 2000 and the early 2000s, but at least almost in every presidential election since 1999, he's been a candidate. Best position to inherit Buhari's votes from the north. So he's also from the northeast. The last election, he got most of his votes in the south, but he also competed very well in the north with Buhari. So he's likely the best candidate because of the nature of the candidates in the race. Is the most positioned to inherit Buhari's vote in the north. On paper, he has the most likely pathway to victory. Whether that will translate into actual victory is doubtful. We don't know yet, because there's been a lot of internal battles within his party, which is a big challenge. Well-resourced and experienced political structures. He has some of the oldest political structures in the country. He's also known to be financially. He has good deep pockets financially. And then the PDP has about 11 governors. So that also helps. Rumors of support from some people in the presidency. There are rumors that he has the backing of some people in the presidency. Then religion and ethnicity support for his candidacy in the North. He's a Muslim from the North, so that could also become an advantage in the election. Disadvantages, next slide. Oldest candidate in the race is the oldest candidate in the race. I think he will be 75 by the time the election takes place next year. And that means he will almost be 80 by the time he's completing his first term. He's about the oldest presidential candidate that has ever contested in Nigeria. PDP is badly divided. His party is partly divided. They are struggling with internal crisis, which is likely to affect his candidacy if it's not settled. Then has lost the Southeast. Yeah, I think PDP used to be the strongest party, or they almost had a very strong loyal support in the Southeast and South-South. That's likely not to happen. Peter Obi's emergence means that the Southeast and South-South are likely to vote for Obi almost en masse. The three polls that tipped Obi as the leading candidate, his biggest strengths are from the South-South and Southeast, where his support is almost at 80 to 90%, and that's really strong. I don't know how it's going to be difficult for any party to penetrate that zone with Obi on the ticket. His free market orientation has little appeal in the current economic crisis. Yeah, he's very pro-market, and that also sometimes makes him very unpopular with the masses. When he talks about privatization and all the other things, there's this perception that he's going to sell those assets to himself rather than that it's going to be corruption induced. And a lot of people don't understand those concepts. So also makes him a bit unpopular in the North. This thing. Then he also has to fight against a long-standing perception of corruption. His former principal, former president Obasanjo, has always been highly critical of him and has not stopped criticizing him and always accuses him of corruption. So that's a big obstacle on his way to. Next slide. Then we have Bola Tinubu, the strong man of the Southwest, very well financed with a strong national political network. He's about the most, I think, is the strongest financially in this race. He has been preparing for this position for a very long time, and I think, so that positions him well, mostly Nigerian election where money plays a key role in how you emerge. He has advantage of having 21 APC governors plus the power of APC's incumbency. Yeah, so the APC has 21 governors across the country. Then, of course, the presidency. That's a big, huge advantage in Nigerian elections, and that puts him in a very good position. Strong support from the second Southwest. Yeah, Southwest has the second highest number of voters in the country, apart from the Northwest. So that also is a strong support. He's from the Southwest, and so if he can mobilize Southwest votes on his side, that's a huge advantage for him. Norton backing for his Muslim ticket. He also selected a vice presidential candidate who is a Muslim. That's to be able to attract votes from the North. That could also be an advantage in the race. Likely to get direct support from President Buhari, even though Tinubu was not his favored APC candidate. Yeah, so he's likely to get the direct support of Buhari on the campaign trail. Actually, Buhari has been named as chairman of his campaign team. So we'll see if Buhari will go on the road with him to campaign. Next slide. Yeah, I think the biggest challenge he faces is his fiscal health. There are several public appearances where his health has been in doubt. During the primaries he won, when he was being given the party's flag, it was obvious that he was struggling to hold it. He was obviously shaking. That has been shown in several videos and everything. Right now, he's out of the country, allegedly doing meeting with campaign groups in London, but there's a suspicion that he's there because of his health, taking care of his health rather than this thing. So And his absence is one of the main reasons why the APC has not been able to even start his official campaign. So he's out of the country currently. We don't know when he's coming back into the country. So his health will be something that will be closely watched in the 5 months campaign period. That could be a big deterrent on his what's it called, election chances. Corruption allegations about how he originally made his money. There's been also, like most politicians in Nigeria, he has several allegations of corruption surrounding him. He's not fully backed by all the APC governors. There are speculations that not all the governors are on his side, and that could also affect his this thing. Fears in the party about the implications of his presidency. There are people within the party who think he's too strong financially to hand over the presidency to him, that he will just build an empire, a political empire that will be difficult to break. Then Christians are strongly opposed to his Muslim Slim ticket. Not only, even people within Christians within his party are opposed to his Muslim and have pledged to campaign against him. There's a poor perception about the APC because of Nigeria's current multitude of political, economic, and security problems. The APC used to be strong in the north, but because of the security and economic crisis, that support is now doubtful. The NOI Post does this monthly presidential performance perception index, and it shows that Buhari's rating in the north has dropped significantly over the years and is quietly at almost the the minimum currently, or less than 30% or so. So that could be a big impediment for him. The votes that they were relying on, the votes of Buhari that he's hoping to inherit, he's unlikely to inherit it because the voting pattern and voting perception in the north has changed in the last 3 years or 4 years of Buhari's administration because of high levels of insecurity. Next slide. Then we have Rabiu Kwankwaso. He's the strong man of Kano politics, but because of right now, his appeal seems to have spread out of Kano slightly, and so he's likely to be a huge factor in this election, likely to compete for votes with Atiku and Tinubu in the north. Yeah. So in the north, there's no doubt that he's going to be a major candidate. He's going to compete with Atiku and Tinubu in the north. So the northern votes is likely to be divided between Atiku, Tinubu, and Kwankwaso. He's far less popular outside Kano State or outside the north, core north. So that's his bid. Then poorly financially resourced. It doesn't have the deep pockets of a Tinubu or Atiku. That's also a huge challenge. So next slide. What does it take to win this election? Simple majority, then plus 25% of votes in 24 states. So you have to get a simple majority of votes cast, but you also need to get 25% of votes cast in 24 states to be able to be declared president. Based on current projections and polls, it's almost unlikely that any candidate will meet this requirement because all the candidates have their areas of strength. Obi is strongest in the south, and southeast. Atiku is on paper is strongest in the northeast and northwest. Tinubu on paper is strong in the southwest. Rabiu is strong in Kano. So it looks very unlikely that any of the candidates is going to meet the requirement to win on the first ballot. So there's a chance, a 51% chance that there's going to be a runoff, and a 49% of chance of so the prediction is more or less like it's most likely there's going to be a runoff for the first time since 1999. Next slide. But yeah, what could turn the tide? Kwankwaso could ally himself, could form an ally, could just join one of the major candidates. If Kwankwaso decides to form some sort of merger with either Tinubu or Atiku, that could change the prediction of a runoff, because that could give whoever he forms an alliance with an edge in the north, which could make a lot of difference. Election day dynamics. even though Tinubu is determined, even though Buhari is determined to hold a free and fair elections, there could be voter suppression by the security forces to favor Tinubu and the APC. Yeah. So voter suppression has been a very strong strategy used by incumbent parties in Nigeria. It's a matter of just pushing out the security agents out and then making sure that the people are afraid to come out to vote. And that could easily be used to favor the ruling party, especially now with high levels of insecurity across the country. They could easily, for areas they think they won't get maximum number of votes, for reasons of insecurity, they could push out the military and the security forces and the police to make sure that people don't come out to vote as much as possible. And then allow the areas where they think they can win for people to come out to vote. That could change the outcome of the election. Outright rigging, that is going to be a bit difficult these days with the bimodal voter accreditation system employed by INEC. So that is, I don't expect rigging of the election. I expect that there will be other forms of ways to make sure that voters don't come out to vote. Massive vote buying, that has been a strategy that has also been used mostly in recent elections since the introduction of the beavers in Ekiti and Osun state elections. We saw vote buying being used as a strategy to win voters. So that is likely to favor candidates with deep pockets. Next slide. What the winner inherits. So we've said that the winner of this election actually loses at the end of the day because is a very Nigeria is in a very what's it called? The economic situation is in a very bad state. We have high levels of insecurity in the northwest, northeast, and southeast. That's what the winner of the election has to deal with immediately. Record low oil production. We did about 900,000 barrels per day in August, compared with 1.8 million barrels per day in 2020. We are producing that. We've dropped from the continent's largest crude producer to about fourth currently. Walton, Libya produces more crude than Nigeria currently. Federation revenues are at the lowest they've ever, they've not really increased that much, but debt service has surpassed Federation revenues. The World Bank just predicted that we'll have, by the end of the year, revenues will fall short of, debt service will be over 102% of revenues. So basically, every penny we are spending these days, we are borrowing. We are borrowing to do everything currently. Huge debt obligation to the Central Bank of Nigeria. The Central Bank has basically been funding the government, but that debt is in excess of 20 trillion currently, and is likely to be, by the end of this year, we're likely to be around 27 trillion, 25 to 27 trillion. That's a huge obligation. So the Central Bank is already maxing out its ability to support the government. At the same time, yields and interest rates are going up. So the government's ability to borrow is also constrained. Why at the same time, it needs all the money it can get. So it's a huge problem, fiscal situation for whoever takes over. High interest rates, rising currency rates, weakening naira. The difference between the official rates, official currency, official exchange rates, and the black market rate is that the spread is 70% currently. That's a huge spread that has to be covered either by a devaluation or mostly by a devaluation, and that would not be palatable. Food inflation is at its highest ever, about 22% or thereabout. The World Bank estimates that an additional 15 million Nigerians will fall into poverty by the end of this year. That will take the number of extremely poor people over 50 million. That's over half of the population. Adult population will be living in extreme poverty by the end of the year. The Doctors Without Borders have recently raised an alarm that there's catastrophic malnutrition levels in the Northwest due to high levels of food costs, due to rising levels of food costs, and at the same time, the high rising insecurity. All that is having impact in the Northwest, and so that's then very high number of children who are now out of school is, I think, estimated between 15 to 20 million children are out of school currently. These are the issues that the next president faces. Some of the immediate tough decisions that the next president has to make when he comes to power is removal. One big decision he has to make is removal of subsidies. This year, we are estimating, the government is estimating they are likely to spend about 6.7 trillion on subsidies next year. This year is likely to hit about 5 trillion. So that's a lot of money that the government can no longer afford to spend. So the next president has to make a decision to do away with the subsidy. The government wants to do away with it. When he leaves power, that's they've estimated by June, subsidies will go. But then if subsidies go, the price of petrol goes to about 400 naira. That's a very sensitive decision to make for Nigeria. That is likely to make whichever president comes in very unpopular. Naira is currently in the black market, is currently doing around 720, 740. That's the differential from the official rate is almost 70%. The fear is that it could easily fall to 1,000 naira by the end of the year or by early next year if we continue with current policies. That would be very unpopular. With revenues the way they are, the government, whoever takes over, must think of raising VAT from the current 7.5% to maybe 10% and then to 15% to boost revenues. That will also be a very unpopular. As I said, with way revenues are, you need to cut public expenditure, which is already too small. Do you want to engage in staff rationalization, close parastatals? Those are the things the next president will have to decide on. All these are unpopular decisions. Privatization, you decide whether you want to float NNPC, sell other state assets, restructure domestic debts to reduce debt service burden. Those are increase electricity tariffs. Power supply is still one of the worst in Nigeria globally. You need to increase tariffs to create a more, a market-friendly place for power companies to thrive. You need to boost oil production. That's tackle banditry in the north, in the Niger Delta, fight banditry in the north, tackle Southeast separatist movements. All these are difficult decisions that the next president has to take, and it's not going to make him popular. But without taking them, he was likely to have serious issues to deal with. So the outlook for the next president is very bleak. There will be no honeymoon for the new president. That's certain. He's unlikely to be able to rest at any time during his term. The opposition will take advantage of it and make him unpopular. Little chance of re-election because he will be an extremely unpopular president. That's all for me for now.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much, Anthony. Patrick, if you'd like to share your screen. Andre, if you can move to that.
Sure, thanks, Charles. Can you see that?
Not yet. Coming up now. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anthony, for that comprehensive
show presentation.
What's that?
Go to show presentation on at the moment, your slides, we can see them, but okay, carry on.
Okay, yeah, I think it's just a bit delayed, so apologies for that. Thank you, Anthony, for that interesting overview. I'm going to just touch very quickly in 5 to 10 minutes on the macro outlook for Nigeria. Anthony already touched upon many of the salient points here. But just by way of introduction, Nigeria is coming off of about 5 years pre-COVID of relatively stagnant growth, which is the chart on the left. You can see it's been below population growth, real GDP has, for about 5 years now, pre-COVID. We have, due to low base effects from the COVID contraction and some accommodative policy from the government.
Patrick, we're not getting you're not moving the screen.
Okay. Maybe it's best if you run it, Charles, because I'm moving it on my end. I'm not sure why it's not picking up.
All right. Andre, can you run it? Next one. Okay, carry on, Patrick.
Okay, great. Thank you. Right. So GDP growth has been quite stagnant for a while in Nigeria. We're getting a bit of a base effects driven uptick this year. We had growth of 3.5% in the first half of the year. most forecasts are for growth to settle around 3% over the medium term, which is just barely above the population growth rate, meaning really minimal growth in per capita terms. At the same time, we're seeing a spike in inflation. Of course, this isn't unique to Nigeria. We're seeing this the world over, including US, UK, any number of developed countries as well. In Nigeria, we saw inflation hit 20.5% in August. Belatedly, the central bank has finally started to counteract this after sitting on the sidelines during 2021 when most other emerging market central banks were aggressively hiking their policy rate. Since March, the central bank has now finally hiked by about 400 basis points, which is broadly in line with the extent of hikes we've seen across a sample of about 70 different emerging market countries. However, market rates are still sharply negative in real terms. You can see there's a pretty big disconnect between the central bank's policy rate and the rates that actually prevail in the market. This is because the monetary transmission mechanism in Nigeria is very weak. There's a number of reasons for this, which I won't delve into in too much detail. But as Anthony astutely referred to, the central bank has been monetizing much of the deficit over the past 2 years, which has increased liquidity in the system, and really has been relying on the cash reserve ratio as its primary monetary policy tool rather than the repo rate, as most other countries do. The CRR was hiked just the other week to 32.5%, and this is about 25 percentage points wider than the global average. And this is a kind of artificially increased demand for government debt and held down market rates on those securities. Next slide, please, Andre. The chart on the left shows the extent of monetization of the deficit. The red line is the mechanism this goes through. It's called ways and means advances. That reached 2.5% of GDP last year, which was almost 2/3 of the budget deficit, so accounted for the lion's share of financing. This year, we're on pace to exceed that by even more. Over the first 7 months of the year, we've already hit 3.15 trillion naira of monetization, which is about 1.7% of rolling GDP and 40% of the projected full-year deficit. So we're on pace for an even more aggressive rate of monetization this year. Also, of course, the exchange rate is an issue that Anthony referred to, which has been quite important. Throughout Buhari and Governor Emefiele's tenure, their main focus and the main focus of monetary policy in general has really been exchange rate stability, which I think has come at the cost of both growth and inflation. There's been a concern that by allowing the exchange rate to adjust, this will pass through to higher inflation, but the pass-through is already taking place via the parallel market, which you can see it reached 7.25 to the dollar at the end of last month and has depreciated even more in the few days since, compared to an official rate closer to 4.35. So a 70% parallel premium is just shy of the record we saw back in 2017 on the bottom left of that chart, where it reached just shy of 80%. And I think is a pretty clear illustration that further exchange rate flexibility is needed to normalize imbalances in the exchange market, to promote growth and investment in the country, and also to reduce pass-through to inflation via the parallel market. Unfortunately, we don't see that happening before elections. And Emefiele's term actually runs through May 2024. So if he remains at the head of the central bank, then there's a risk that we have to continue muddling through with this really quite damaging and inefficient exchange rate policy for another year and a half or so. Next slide, please, Andre. You can see the impact of this FX supply into the Nigerian economy has been quite low. This is despite the sharp uptick in oil prices. Really, foreign investment has dried up completely. Overall supply and demand in the foreign exchange market is extremely out of balance at this stage. At the same time, we have a still quite large stock of foreign portfolio liabilities in the country. So amongst a number of different instruments, we have about $31 billion, this is as of Q1, of non-resident investors holding government debt in the country, and about $4 billion of equities. I think most of this is effectively trapped in the country due to inability to repatriate their profits. So essentially, they just keep rolling over their debt as it comes due, or refrain from selling their equities because they won't be able to repatriate their money. If these controls were lifted and investors were able to exit the country more freely, there would be a risk of a pretty sharp capital outflow crisis in Nigeria. So clearly, this is something that needs to be accounted for when we move towards a more liberal exchange rate policy, hopefully at some point, and will be a looming risk if and when we reach that point. Next slide, please, Andre. This is a summary of the balance of payments on the left. The current account deficit is the dark blue line. After recording a deficit of about 2.5% of about 0.5% of GDP last year, Nigeria recorded a pretty strong 2.5% of GDP surplus in the first quarter. But you can see this is actually quite low compared to 2012 and 13 on the left of the chart, when oil prices were last at the levels we're seeing now, mainly due to the sharp decline in production that we've seen, which I'll address on the next slide. And the investment inflows have essentially dried up, as I mentioned earlier. FDI was only 0.3% of GDP in 2021, meaning foreign investment in the country is effectively zero. And portfolio investment recorded inflows of about 1.3% of GDP. But most of the deficit is being funded by government borrowing and fairly large net errors and omissions, which are unidentified flows in and out of the country and make analysis of the current account quite difficult. So despite the sharp rise in oil prices this year, you can see reserves have actually slowly bled out from about $40.5 billion at the end of the year to $38.5 billion now, slightly less than that. Which isn't an overly concerning level. It's about 6 months of trailing goods and services imports, and is sufficient to cover Nigeria's external financing needs over the medium term. But this implies that there could be a pretty sharp and alarming drawdown if oil prices revert to levels we saw a couple of years ago, which would require an even more urgent adjustment to the exchange rate policy to balance that. Next slide, please, Andre. On the fiscal front, we've seen the budget deficit, the federal deficit, stabilize at around 4% of GDP over the past 3 years. It's projected to be basically flat this year, and to widen to 5% of GDP in 2023 if fuel subsidies are removed or are removed mid-year. Or 5.5% of GDP if they're kept in place, just to give a sense of the size of the costs, which I'll address again in another slide. So in gross terms, the deficit, compared to many other emerging and advanced economy peers, really isn't that alarming. Likewise, the debt stock doesn't look too concerning as well. Official figures put it at around 23% of GDP, but this is excluding central bank advances, which are around 11% of GDP, and AMCON bonds, which are about 3% of GDP. So the true all-in public debt stock, which includes state debt, is actually about 36%. Again, it's ticked up quite aggressively over the past decade, but from a pretty low base. Next slide, please, Andre. However, from a liquidity and debt service perspective, it looks quite a bit more alarming. So revenue, which is the dark blue line on the left, has plummeted over the past decade. It was only 2.5% of GDP for federally retained revenue last year, and about just over 5% for overall gross revenue collected by the federal government. And debt service at the same time has been ticking up. It's largely domestic. But in 2021, interest payments absorbed 85% of federally retained revenue and 40% of gross revenue. And in 2022 so far, this has ticked up to 138% of federally retained revenue and almost 2/3 of federally collected revenue. So this is clearly an unsustainable situation that stems both from a rising interest burden, but also just incredibly weak revenue collection. I mean, 2.5% of GDP, I think, could be the lowest in the world. And there's a really clear and urgent need to boost revenue collection so the state has the ability to invest in physical and human capital and other pro-growth measures. That said, like I mentioned, most of the interest burden is domestic. And actually, if you look at the Eurobond maturity profile, it's really negligible over the next 3 or 4 years. So we have no more Eurobond maturities this year. We have about 500 million maturing next year, none in 2024. And really the first big payments of about $4.5 billion coming due in 2026. So on the external debt service front, Nigeria really has some runway to make these payments. And I think there's very little risk of default on Nigeria's external debt for the time being. Notwithstanding a pretty bleak fundamental outlook, as I've outlined. Next slide, please, Andre. On the subsidy front, the red line on the left is subsidy costs over the past 2 years. And you can see it's increased to absorb almost the entirety of the NNPC's revenue. The way the accounting works here is that the subsidy is taken out before revenue is remitted to the federal government. So part of the decline in revenue we're seeing actually is due to a net decline in oil revenue, which just flows through to the top line. But you can see the light blue line in the left chart. The NNPC has failed to remit any revenue to the federal government for the entire year now, for 8 months running. Which really is quite remarkable when you consider oil prices, at near record highs. And this is simply because the subsidy cost has become overwhelmingly high. And oil production at the same time, as I mentioned before, has been plummeting. From a decade ago when we were seeing 2.5 million barrels per day, we saw it tick down to about 1.8 million barrels per day last year. And it's plummeted even further to less than a million barrels per day as of the last print, which I think was August. And as Anthony said, that puts Nigeria now, for the first time in a long time, as no longer the largest oil producer on the continent. And with oil production at current levels, I think it's a clear argument that higher oil prices actually hurts Nigeria rather than helps it. Due to the increased fiscal costs and more limited positive impact on the balance of payments. Next slide, please, Sandra. And then lastly, what does this mean for Nigeria's bonds? You can see its Eurobonds have performed quite poorly this year. We've had a bit of a rally since I published these charts a couple of days ago, but Nigeria's sovereign bond spreads have nearly doubled over the past year to almost 1,100 basis points. And they've widened by about twice as much as the broader EM high yield index has, delivering a total return of negative 27% versus negative 22% for the EM high yield index. Looking at specific bonds rather than the index itself, on the right, you can see the 10-year equivalent, which is the 2032. Its yield has increased to over 15%, and it has a cash price of below $65, which is pricing in a very high risk of distress. Part of this is broader EM weakness, but part of this is Nigeria specific as well. That said, as we mentioned before, I think the risk of default on external debt is really quite low over the medium term. And while I think fundamentally, things are quite weak for Nigeria and they'll likely continue to muddle through, that doesn't mean that solvency is at risk for the time being. And I think the risk of distress is being more than priced into its bonds. So we have an existing buy recommendation on Nigeria's Eurobonds, particularly on the 2032, just on a valuation basis. We don't love the fundamental outlook. But I think compared to many of its other peers, it looks quite attractive on a relative basis. So that's the general overview. Happy to delve into any of these issues in more detail in the Q&A.
All right, thank you very much. Donu, if you'd like to make your comments, you've got about 5 minutes. If you just want to come off mute. Okay.
Right, okay. Thank you, Anthony and Patrick, for very interesting talks. What I would say, I'm always very amused almost when I hear the economy being talked about in sort of almost a sort of traditional intellectual economist economic analysis way. Because from where I'm sitting in Abuja, it's all a lot more chaotic than that. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's nothing seems to work properly. And all this talk about Eurobonds and interest rates and things doesn't seem to apply to an economy as chaotic and almost backward as this one. But that's just a passing aside. I wanted to also say that the political situation is quite concerning because the majority of people appear to, at least the people I know, appear to be desperate for change. And most of the people I know are supporting Peter Obi, the candidate Anthony spoke about. But the question is whether he will be allowed to win in inverted commas. And of course, you know, he does have some genuine handicaps, such as, for example, you know, the likelihood that he won't get many votes in the north, being the only Christian candidate. And of course, he's a novice in some ways. I mean, he's been a state governor and he's been on the political stage for a long time. But, you know, this whole thing about being a sort of big shot presidential candidate is a new thing for him. Unlike Atiku, who has run several times in the past, and Tinubu, who was a major mover and shaker in one region at least, which is the southeast, and you know, possibly the most powerful economically since Lagos is situated there. So, you know, I'm quite concerned about the fact that I really don't know whether the will of the people will be respected if Obi does as well as he might. I am also aware that possibly he's a product of the metropolitan elites, the chattering classes. How much real support he has at the grassroots is questionable. I'd like to, so, I mean, I've rambled on a little bit there. I want to ask Anthony whether he thinks Obi can really, really pull in votes outside the Southeast, where he comes from, at grassroots level. I'd also like to ask Patrick, who definitely seems to know a lot about you know, the economic aspect, whether he thinks that this drive to increase revenue collection is a good thing or a bad thing. Because, you know, Nigerians are being taxed more now than they've ever been. And they're getting very little in return for their, you know, tax they're paying or are expected to pay. Arguments that says that the more people invest in the economy, the more likely they are to be, it's more democratic because they're real stakeholders as opposed to people collecting oil revenue on your behalf and then spending on your behalf. If they're spending money that you've actually contributed to the coffers, then you have more say in a way. But then again, you see, I come from the Niger Delta where the oil comes from. And there's always been a very poor accountability around oil revenue. And I wonder what accountability we're going to get around tax revenue. The reason I'm making this point is I believe that foreign countries like the United Kingdom, for example, have advised the federal government to, you know, improve the tax collection structure and modernize it. And I know that in Lagos, for example, people are really, you know, feeling the burden. And tax is a controversial issue in a country where the government does not provide electricity 24/7 and does not provide, you know, you basically have to provide so many basic services for yourself. We know what the security challenges are. So, okay, I'll stop rambling on and I'll just rephrase that and say, Patrick, do you think it's a good thing for tax to become more of a factor? Can you see any advantage in that in an economy, in a country where government doesn't play a strong enough role and doesn't provide enough in return? And Anthony, do you think that seem to favor the idea that Peter Obi is the most popular candidate? And indeed, as you said, 3 opinion polls have given him a lead. Do you really think he can win?
Okay, perhaps Anthony can go first.
Yeah, that's a tough question to ask. A bit to answer. The one thing I've said about all the polls came out before campaign starts, so I won't take them as a good predictor of what's likely to happen at the elections. New polls have to be done, maybe around November or December, to see if perceptions remain the same. But yeah, from where I sit, do I think he can win? I think it's not impossible he can win. It's not impossible. It depends on voter turnout, and that's why I mentioned the voter intimidation. If there's high voter turnout in the South, and Southeast, then he has a very good chance of winning. Because, as I said, the 3 polls so far show his support in the South, and Southeast is as high as between 70 to 80%. That's huge. For none of the other presidential candidates have that same support among voters in any of the other regions. So he looks able to get, on paper, he's in a position to get an overwhelming vote in the South, and Southeast and compete for votes in the other parts of the country, except the Northeast and Northwest. And that gives him a very good, significant headway into winning the election. Maybe not on the first round, but at least giving him almost a majority of votes at the end of the day, depending on if there's no voter suppression, depending on turnout in the South, and Southeast, which will also depend on whether the security agencies will allow them to come out to vote, and then how his spread he's able to make it up with other votes in the other parts of the world, because he's like a dominant player in South, Southwest, while all the other contestants have active, competition in their own zones. But he has no competition in his own zone. But all the other players will compete with other voters in their own zones.
Okay.
And that's a huge edge for him in the race.
Okay, Patrick, sorry, we have to move on.
I can ask you, sorry, Charles, I'll just ask quickly. If he appears to have won, but is prevented from winning in inverted commas, do you think there will be riots of the NSAS type, especially amongst his younger supporters?
Okay, I'll quickly answer. I've just said, what I think, in my opinion, what I think a lot of anti-Obi supporters are missing out is that he's a representation of the frustration of the Nigerian youth, which they are trying to express politically through him. And I think the country should be happy that is happening. I'm just wondering if that expression of that frustration fails, the country should be looking for a ways to tap that frustration in a positive way in order not for it to, for it not to have a negative impact on the country. Because currently what you have is those who can afford to leave the country are leaving. The youths who can afford to leave the country are leaving. Those who cannot afford to leave the country are expressing their frustration through a Peter Obi, using Peter Obi to protest against the status quo. If that fails, then the Nigerian elite should think of a way to tap into the frustration of the Nigerian youth. I don't think it will go away. It showed in NSAS, it's showing in a Peter Obi. The question is, if it doesn't succeed in Peter Obi, where else will it show? So the Nigerian elites, the Nigerian government should look at it. Whoever becomes president, if it's not Peter Obi, even if it's Peter Obi, should look for a way to harness that youth frustration into something positive, or else we may have it explode in a way that the country doesn't like. So that's the way I look at it.
Okay. All right. I think we're going to have to move on. We've got a number of questions. So, Patrick, do you want to answer the question that Donu raised? And then I'll mention the other.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Donu. I think it's an interesting philosophical question to a certain extent. I mean, to your point, if Nigerians are imposed an even greater tax burden, but service delivery remains the same, which is to say quite negligible, then clearly that's not a sustainable or fair route to go. But to an extent, it's a bit of a circular question, right? I mean, part of the reason that service provision is so poor is that Nigeria collects the lowest in the world relative to its economy and revenue. So to improve service provision, it needs to increase revenue. And for Nigeria to have sustainable growth over the long term, there needs to be at least a basic level of provision of infrastructure and security, and the things that any economy needs to sustainably grow. So yes, tax revenue needs to increase. I think there needs to be a debate about the way that's undertaken. I mean, obviously the VAT is low-hanging fruit, but it imposes the burden across a wide net of Nigerians. And the other point here is that, maybe the first step needs to be more efficient expenditure before they start ramping up that tax net. Because, all their revenue now is being used to service debt and fund a fuel subsidy, which is incredibly regressive and really only benefits the most fortunate Nigerians. So that needs to be removed and the revenue reallocated towards a more well-targeted support program for those who are truly in need in Nigeria, and that doesn't have such a, effect on misallocation and inefficiency in the economy. And that will free up some resources for the government to spend on the services that the country actually needs, and then start building up the tax net and social contract from there. But I mean, I think it's a difficult question. There's no easy answers, and it's kind of a chicken and egg type scenario.
Okay. Anthony, a couple of questions on oil. Have any of the candidates made statements about what they do as far as fuel subsidies are concerned? And secondly, is security the only reason for oil production falling?
On the first, I think both Peter Obi and Atiku Abubakar have been very clear about taking out subsidies if they come in. That's an unpopular statement to make during an election year, but I think that they've said it, that they are going to do away with subsidies. Tinubu has not really been forthcoming with interviews, so it's a bit difficult to see his position on subsidies. The question, I think, for most candidates is whether they will remove it at once or they will stagger the removal over a period of time. But I think both Atiku and Obi has made it a point that they will take it out and invest in more productive forms. The other question is if insecurity is the cause of low oil production.
Yeah, is it the only one?
I don't think so. The low oil production is a bit baffling. I think goes beyond insecurity. As Obi put it, if I may quote him, he says it looks more like an organized crime. The level of oil, Kyari, the CEO of NNPC, said yesterday that up to 600,000 barrels have been shut in because of the situation in the Niger Delta. But I think the level at which the production has dropped goes beyond insecurity. The government, if we didn't have, I don't know, it's either a governance weakness, and you won't admit that the government is that weak to allow that level of oil to be lost to the system. It's if you admit that, then we'll have even a bigger issue on our hands.
Okay. Patrick, question here. The governor has followed more orthodox policies since he abandoned his own presidential campaign. Rates are rising and the naira is weakening. What's the end game? should Nigeria go to the IMF?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's been an encouraging shift at the margins in policy. Like I said, they finally belatedly started hiking rates and started moving, general liquidity in the system in a tighter direction. That said, Emefiele's tenure at the central bank has been filled with baffling own goals. I mean, the exchange rate regime alone has been one of the key impediments to growth in Nigeria. And I think has been one of the most disastrous yet easy to fix policies. Do I think he's going to move in an orthodox enough direction to fix that? No, I mean, I think it's a philosophical difference, and he really truly believes exchange rate stability is the right path for Nigeria. So I think, unfortunately, until Emefiele is removed from office, there's really very little prospect for normalization of monetary policy in Nigeria and for functioning of its exchange rate market.
Okay.
Sorry, Charles, what was the second part of the question?
No, will they have to go to the IMF?
Strictly speaking, I mean, the IMF is really there for balance of payments support in the event of crises. Nigeria is not facing a balance of payments crisis. Its troubles stem from its exchange rate regime, not a broader imbalance in the economy. That said, if oil prices drop, then I think an IMF program would have to be a necessary component of that adjustment. And exchange rate adjustment will be a pillar of any sort of IMF reform program.
Okay. Anthony, normally one has zoning of the presidency between Muslims and Christians. Now you have a likely Muslim candidate if Obi doesn't win. Will this intensify the secessionist movement in the southeast?
That should be expected if Obi doesn't win and in another Muslim candidate, another northern candidate emerges. Yeah, it should not only in the north southeast. We should also expect it a bit. We've seen some stirring of separatist movements in the southwest. We should also see that maybe come back if another northern candidate becomes the president. Yeah. That's a likelihood, yeah.
All right, we've got time for about two more questions, and I'm going to leave one more to Donu, or Donu to have a comment. Anthony, which candidate is most open to foreign investment? Is there a difference in foreign trade and investment policy between them?
It's difficult to, well, I think for the candidate that is most likely will be an Abubakar will likely pursue a more open pro-market, what's it called? Even Tinubu, based on his antecedents in Lagos, I think a pro-market direction for the next president is not something within his control. Within his control, because the economy is in such a bad state that you can't afford to do otherwise without collapsing the economy totally on your head. So opening it up to foreign investment, for instance, maybe Patrick will say more on it. I don't think the government has capacity to even borrow again, based on where it is now. Interest rates, the next budget will have a deficit of 12 trillion naira. The domestic markets can't absorb 12 trillion naira. So they will have to look at foreign debt markets. But they can't do that because interest rates are too high in the foreign debt market. So they may have to turn to the central bank again. And then the central bank, you're already overborrowed with the central bank. And so you are lost. So basically, you have to open up the economy for foreign investments to come in, or else you're cooked.
We've got 2 more minutes. Patrick, any final 30-second point?
No, I mean, I think we've covered all the main issues. Like I said, I think there's a lot of structural issues that need to be addressed in Nigeria, a lot of basic macro policies that have been botched under the current administration. I'm hopeful that whoever wins will take a different tone on those policies, key among them fuel subsidy exchange rate, but remains to be seen what direction they'll head in.
All right, fine. Donu, you've got one minute and then we must close.
Okay, I'll say 2 words: corruption and patriotism. That is what Nigeria needs. You know, all this stuff about charts and interest rates and subsidy, nothing beats leaders who have the nation's genuine interests at heart and are not going to steal us blind. And this is what most people like about Peter Obi. Atiku and Tinubu are also capable of providing ethical leadership if they want to.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We've now reached our deadline. So thank you very much to our two speakers and also to Donu. We'll be in touch tomorrow about the podcast and the slides. Do join us next time on the 2nd of November when we'll be talking about the US midterm elections. So many thanks to everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Right, thank you.